All right, so today we're talking about how has Western culture changed in the late 20th century. I'm going to do my best to get through this as quickly as possible since it's Thanksgiving weekend and I have some pies to bake. So, today the first question we're going to talk about is how has culture changed in the area of art? Now, for most of the 19th into the early 20th century, the art world was dominated by France, Paris, Germany, as well as Germany were like the centers of the modern art movement, especially Germany. But in the second half of the 20th century, the U.S. actually begins to dominate the art world. And what we see, the art of post-war U.S. is very vibrant colors filled with activity and energy and exuberance. After 1945, like I said, New York City becomes the artistic center of the world with places opening like the Guggenheim Museum, MoMA, and the Whitney Museum. And if you haven't been to those three museums, since we live so close to New York City, I would highly, highly recommend all three of them. Especially the Guggenheim, because the Guggenheim in itself is a work of art. It's a Frank Lloyd Wright building. But anyway, so abstractionism, though, becomes mainstream, especially abstract expressionism. So in particular, you can see here the exuberance, the movement, the color, but in particular the works of Jackson Pollock. So Jackson Pollock would make the paint kind of explode onto the viewer, because basically the way he would paint is he would lay the canvas out on the ground and kind of do these like flicks and, you know, throwing the paint across the canvas and create these swirling forms and these chaotic patterns, which doesn't really do it justice if you look at it on a flat painting, because you really have to look at it in person to see all the different layers of paint that he builds up, these swirling forms and these chaotic patterns that he actually makes with the paint. A quote from Jackson Pollock about his painting, he says, "When I am in the painting, I am not aware of what I'm doing. This is pure harmony." And so he'd become completely immersed in the creation of his paintings. Another major art movement that happens in the 1960s is pop art, which is taking images from popular culture and transforming them into works of fine art. And probably the most well-known one to do this was Andy Warhol. And he would take images from commercial art and that were mass-produced and to show the fleeting whims of pop culture. That was a very famous one of Marilyn Monroe. That's of the Campbell soup can. Another famous one that itself is Andy Warhol. So in the 1980s, we have what's referred to as the postmodern movement in art, which moves away from what was the cutting edge qualities of modernism, and it favors tradition and taking earlier styles of painting and elevating traditional crafts also to the levels of fine art. So we could see things like this. Also more practical art being used in the kind of postmodern era, more decorative arts, and which would be considered like furniture and those types of things. But also we have, you can see building forms like this. This here is the Pompidou Museum. It's in Paris. It is an example of this modern work where the function of the building becomes part of the art. So everything in this building, the whole like inner workings of the building, like this, the heat lines, the water lines, the air lines, all these different things that are usually inside the walls of a building are on the exterior of the building. That's why the staircases are on the exterior of the building. So everything that makes the building function is out for everyone to see. So this is the Modern Art Museum in Paris. It was to a great uproar when it was built. Some people in the neighborhood thought that this was like, you know, the most ghastly thing they've ever seen. Other people really kind of embraced it. If you ever have an opportunity to go to Paris and see the Pompidou Museum, it really is interesting just as the work of the building itself. But what also is interesting is as you're looking at this incredibly, incredibly modern building, like right next to it is like an old, maybe potentially Gothic cathedral, you know, a little small church. You know, these little quaint cafes that kind of makes up Paris, but then this like huge, very modern, in-your-face type of building. But so we also start to see a movement that's referred to as neo-realism. Now this is a grainy picture of this, but this is actually a painting, not a photograph. If it wasn't so grainy, you'd be able to see it better. But you want to paint or sculpt with minute attention to detail, and you want your paintings to actually appear to be photographs or actually appear to be photographs, like you see here in this painting of the candle with the flame. The subjects are ordinary individuals, usually stuck in ordinary lives, and it's actually very pessimistic and cynical. I can see that's another neo-realism. But the goal, like I said, is to try to make it look as much like a photograph as you possibly can. We also have what's referred to as abstract expressionism or neo-expressionism. Anselm Kiefer was a German artist who used this to kind of where he combined abstract expressionism, collage. This is his painting called The Resurrection. Collage and German expressionism, and to create very haunting and stark works. One of his other works, which I don't have, this is a work called Jerusalem. One of his works is called The Departure of Egypt. He made in 1984, which was a meditation on Jewish history as it descended into the horrors of Nazism. And his goal was to portray Germany's atrocities. So by doing that, they could free the Germans from their past and bring some good out of the evil of the Nazi era. Now, how did literature change in the postmodern era? So the most significant new trend in literature was something called the theater of the absurd. For those of you that are going to be in AP literature in 12th grade, you probably will be learning about some of these. In France, the most famous, he's actually an Irish author, but he wrote in France. His name was Samuel Beckett. He wrote a play called Waiting for Godot. Nothing happens in the play, literally. It's just these two guys, as you see in this picture, just waiting. You never know who they're waiting for. You don't know why they're waiting. They're just waiting. That's the whole play. And so the audience doesn't know if the action is real or if it is fake. And it's supposed to create a sense of suspense from wondering what exactly is happening. It's supposed to also express the post-war period's feelings of disillusionment with politics and with religion. It's also supposed to emphasize the meaninglessness of the world and a desolate worldview. In places like Latin America, you have a movement, Latin America, Central and Eastern Europe as well. You have a movement that's referred to as magic realism. And in magic realism, you have realistic events merged with dreamlike and fantastic backgrounds. This is a Czech example of Milan Kundera, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. A Latin American author is Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who wrote 100 Years of Solitude, which is the story of the town of Macondo, and it's generations of the founding family, and it slips between the generations and between fact and fantasy. Milan Kundera, who was from Czechoslovakia, used fantasy to examine moral issues and was actually tended to be more optimistic of the human condition. And in this book, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, the characters use love as a way to better their life. So a little bit more optimistic viewpoint. So next question. Why did the theory of existentialism become so important in the 20th century? Now, you can imagine how basically messed up many people were just from living through two devastating world wars. This created a great deal of desperation amongst people, feelings of, why are they here? What is the point? And it led to the breakdown of traditional values. So the two most famous of the existentialists is Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. And in their books, they talk about the absence of God in the universe and that humans had no destiny and were alone with no future and no hope. And that the world was absurd and there was no meaning and there was no purpose. And being reduced to despair and depression, the only ground for hope, since it's not going to be God and it's not going to be religion, it's going to be yourself. So Camus talked about that the world could not be absurd unless people judged it to be so. And Sartre said, man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. So it's humans have to create their own values and give their lives meaning. And this can only be done by their involvement in their life. The individual has to be true to themselves at all times and refuse to be depersonalized by society. And so here you can see, what is the endless, senseless series of meaningless experiences trying to teach me? And this is also kind of very existentialist type of sculpture where the being is just kind of like faceless and kind of, lost and looking for an answer for themselves. So the next question is, you have then the extreme. You have existentialism, which is saying, God is dead, there is no God. We only have ourselves to look into for answers. And on the flip side, you also have a revival of religion at the same time. So basically, this also was a reaction to the collapse of civilization in the 20th century. So in response to World War I and World War II, some went, that there is no meaning and there is no hope. And some went, we have to kind of find ourselves more faith in God. So one Protestant named Karl Barton wanted to reinterpret the Reformation era for the modern world. And he said that he kind of emphasized the sinful and imperfect nature of humans, and only through religious truth can people find the grace of God. Catholic leader Karl Radner wanted to modernize Catholic theology. And then Pope John the 22nd and Pope John Paul II both tried to kind of reform the Catholic Church in many ways. Pope John Paul II, of course, was a very, very, very popular pope. So Pope John Paul the 22nd started the 21st Ecumenical Council of the Catholic Church. Every set time of years, the church would have these ecumenical councils. This one was referred to as Vatican II. And what this did is it liberalized the Catholic practices and opened a new communication between Catholicism and other Christian faiths. John Paul II was the first non-Italian pope to be pope since the 16th century. He was from Poland. He reasserted traditional Catholic teachings, such as emphasis on birth, bans on birth control, not allowing women into the priesthood, maintaining clerical celibacy. But he traveled throughout the world to strengthen the Catholic Church throughout the non-Western world, and because of that was an incredibly, incredibly popular pope. He also started World Youth Day, where Catholics from all over the world would gather. Young Catholics would gather all at different points in different parts of the world to kind of like practice, to have mass together and to kind of, practice their faith together. And then on the other side of this, you also have, And on the other side of this, you have how has science and technology changed people's lives? So during the war, theoretical science and technology began to be joined together. Governments began to sponsor scientific research during World War II, and science basically becomes so complex that only large organizations with huge teams of scientists and huge labs and complex equipments can actually make scientific breakthroughs. Whereas we're going to look back when we talk about the scientific revolution, you would have kind of, regular people kind of get together, form scientific societies and get together and discuss different theories and different ideas and different experimentations that they were doing and bounce ideas off each other. Now this isn't possible. Science has become way far beyond that and is way too complex. So this new scientific establishment led to a space race in the 1960s, which of course was also a manifestation of the Cold War. So in 1957, the Soviets sent the first satellite into orbit, which was known as Sputnik. And then the U.S. launched a huge project to place a manned spacecraft into orbit. And people began to question the power of science, the usefulness of science, and began to question the assumption that scientific knowledge gave humans the ability to manipulate the environment for their benefits. And we kind of see that now with some of the backlash against like GMOs and those types of things. Like, have we gone too far with manipulating the environment beyond what we should be doing? Should just, Mother Nature be allowed to run its course, or should we really be interfering with nature? Because some technological advancements had the side effect of damaging the environment, and we see that, like I said before, now with global warming. And the response to this movement towards more scientific experimentation and knowledge, we see environmentalism beginning to become an important issue. So the last question, see, I told you I'm trying to be as fast as possible. How had the explosion of popular culture changed the world? So in the late 20th century, the U.S. becomes the most influential force in shaping popular culture in the West. Movies, music, advertising, TV consumerism was all U.S. U.S. made. In 1923, It was said, the film is to America what the flag was once to Britain. By its means, Uncle Sam may hope someday to Americanize the world. In the 1960s, 40% of Hollywood's income was coming in from Europe. And in the 1960s, TV was spreading around the world, and American TV shows were sold and many foreign countries bought American TV shows because for like the BBC, which is the British Broadcasting Channel, they could buy American programs and air them on TV for 1/10 the price of making their own programs. Although Britcoms are actually pretty good. British TV is actually really good. A lot of our shows that actually started out as British TV shows. But the U.S. also dominated popular music with things like jazz and blues and R&B, and then moving into rap and rock, which originated in the U.S., kind of rooted in African American innovations. This spread around the world and then transformed itself as it kind of came back into the U.S. So 1967 to 1973 is considered the golden age of rock. And we start to see hybrid blues and rock kind of come together. And you see that in British bands like the Rolling Stones. And these musicians began to focus on social issues, against war, against materialism. 1976 to 1979 was the punk movement that started in New York. It went to Britain, and I said where it gained great popularity. It was fueled by a poor economy and large numbers of unemployed and undereducated kind of turned to punk as a way to the punk movement to kind of like express themselves and their discontentment with society and kind of fighting against norms. Sports also become a major part of pop culture and leisure. First off, it's a cheap form of entertainment, well, except for before cable, but it was a cheap form of entertainment. You didn't have to leave home. The modern Olympics movement, which was funded primarily by American TV, because we were talking about in class with the whole Munich issue in the Munich Olympics in 1972. The reason why they targeted the Olympics is because everyone's watching the Olympics. Football becomes the most dominant world sport, and it becomes a way for nationalist sentiment and expression. And the World Cup is, like I said before in class, is the most watched event on TV. And this mixture of politics and sports kind of played itself out in the Olympic Games. So 1952, the Olympics began to take on some severe, Cold War implications because the Soviets put a huge amount of money and interest in trying to win gold medals at the Olympics to be a way to create nationalism, to promote the communist system. In 1956, 6 nations withdrew from the Olympics to protest the Soviets crushing the Hungarian uprising in 1956. In 1972, 37 African nations threatened to pull out of the Munich Olympics because of apartheid in South Africa. We know in 1972 that 11 Israelis were taken hostage during the Olympics. In 1980, the U.S. boycotted the Moscow Games to protest Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and the Soviets responded by boycotting the 1984 LA Olympics. So we can see that the Olympics becomes a way for political conflicts to kind of play itself out on the world stage. So that leads us to our summary. Why did Western culture change in the late 20th century? I hope you all have a lovely, lovely Thanksgiving, and I'll see you all in school on Monday.